When Ethan and Jordan were sent to Camp Breakwater, they had no idea their worlds were about to collide. Forced into a place filled with rules, schedules, and people they despised, all they wanted was to escape. But one restless night by the lake, a single encounter would ignite a connection neither of them could have predicted. A daring bet. A stolen kiss? A love that would risk everything. This summer wasn't just about breaking the rules, it was about breaking free. Their story will shock you, pull at your heartstrings, and leave you questioning everything about love and rebellion. Ethan's fists clenched tightly as the car came to an abrupt stop at the gravel road leading to Camp Breakwater. The engine hummed for a moment before shutting off, and his father barely glanced back at him. "You're staying here until you learn some discipline," he said gruffly, his tone as cold as the air-conditioned interior. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't bother responding. What was the point? They weren't here to listen. As he stepped out of the car, the oppressive summer heat slapped him in the face. Sweat began to bead on his forehead almost immediately. The camp looked worse than he imagined. Rows of old wooden cabins, a tall peeling fence surrounding the perimeter, and a towering sign that read, "Camp Breakwater, a place to rebuild." It was anything but welcoming. He watched his parents drive away without so much as a backward glance, leaving him standing there with his duffel bag and a growing sense of dread. Across the camp, another car was pulling up to the same dismal scene. Jordan leaned against the window, his face set in a stony glare. His mother was talking, but he wasn't listening. He had already heard it all. "This is for your own good. You need to stop fighting. Why can't you just be normal?" Her words grated on him. "Are you even listening to me, Jordan?" she snapped, but before he could retort, the car came to a screeching halt. He swung the door open and slammed it shut with enough force to make her wince. Jordan's gaze scanned the camp, his lips curling in disdain. "Looks like a prison?" he muttered under his breath. With a heavy sigh, he hoisted his backpack over his shoulder and began walking toward the main office. The sooner he got this over with, the better. The first day at Camp Breakwater was as miserable as Ethan and Jordan had feared. From the moment they arrived, they were subjected to a whirlwind of introductions, rules, and endless schedules. Wake-up call at 6 a.m., group therapy at 9 a.m. Lunch at noon. Free time, if you could call 30 minutes of forced socialization free, at 2 p.m. Evenings were no better, filled with lectures on accountability and teamwork. By the time the sun began to set, Ethan was already on the verge of snapping. He sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the cabin walls. His cabin mates were loud, obnoxious, and seemed perfectly content being there. Ethan couldn't understand it. "This place is hell," he muttered under his breath, running a hand through his messy blonde hair. His thoughts wandered to his parents. How could they dump me here? He let out a bitter laugh. Fix myself? What a joke. Jordan, on the other hand, spent most of the day scowling at anyone who tried to approach him. His assigned cabin felt suffocating, and the cheerful camp counselors only made things worse. When the lights out call came at 10 p.m., he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts swirled with anger and frustration. He didn't belong here. He didn't need fixing. He just needed to be left alone. As the camp quieted down, both Ethan and Jordan found themselves restless. Sleep was impossible, not with the weight of resentment pressing down on them. Somewhere deep in the night, Ethan finally had enough. Throwing on a hoodie, he quietly slipped out of the cabin. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the stifling heat of the day. He didn't know where he was going, he just needed to get away. Jordan, it turned out, had the same idea. He had been lying by the lake for over an hour, letting the gentle lapping of the water calm his nerves. The moonlight reflected off the surface, casting an ethereal glow over the scene. His thoughts were a chaotic mess, but the solitude helped. That was, until he heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path behind him. His muscles tensed as he turned his head. Standing there, framed by the moonlight, was a figure Jordan hadn't seen before. Ethan froze when their eyes met. Jordan's deep piercing gaze seemed to cut right through him. For a moment, neither of them said a word. The air between them was charged, electric. "You're not supposed to be out here," Jordan finally said, his voice low and calm, but there was a hint of curiosity in his tone. Ethan smirked. "Neither are you?" Jordan raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching into a faint grin. "Touché." He shifted slightly, gesturing to the spot beside him. "Might as well join me. Unless you're afraid of breaking the rules." Ethan hesitated for a moment before walking over. He dropped down beside Jordan, their shoulders almost brushing. The silence between them was comfortable, yet filled with unspoken tension. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined. Something that would change everything. Ethan sat beside Jordan, his heart racing for reasons he couldn't explain. The cool breeze from the lake carried the scent of pine trees, and the moonlight bathed the two in a silvery glow. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet was surprisingly comforting, as if neither felt the need to fill the silence with meaningless words. Jordan broke the stillness first, his voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "So what's your story? Why'd they dump you here?" Then hesitated, his fingers brushing over the gravel beneath him. He didn't know this guy anything, but there was something about Jordan's presence that made him drop his guard. "I guess you could say I have a bit of a temper," he admitted, glancing at the water. "Got into one too many fights. My parents decided I needed to be fixed." He air-quoted the word with a bitter laugh. Jordan smirked faintly. "Same here. Well, kind of. I don't fight unless I have to, but I guess my bad attitude doesn't sit well with my parents. They're convinced this place will straighten me out." He leaned back on his hands, his dark eyes gazing up at the stars. "Joke's on them. I don't plan on changing." Ethan chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Yeah, this place feels more like a punishment than a solution." Jordan nodded, his expression softening. "You've got that right. They want us to fit into some perfect little mold, but that's never gonna happen. Not for me anyway." Ethan looked at Jordan, studying him in the moonlight. His athletic build and confident demeanor exuded strength, but there was a vulnerability in his words that caught Ethan off guard. "You don't seem like the type to follow rules," Ethan said, a playful edge in his tone. Jordan's grin widened. "I'm not. And I'm guessing you aren't either, considering you're out here breaking curfew." Ethan smirked. "Fair point." The conversation flowed more easily after that, each of them peeling back layers of their guarded personalities. They talked about their families, their frustrations, and the things they hated most about Camp Breakwater. Despite their shared resentment for the camp, there was something refreshing about being around someone who understood the suffocating expectations of others. At one point, Ethan glanced over at Jordan and noticed the way the moonlight highlighted his features. His sharp jawline, his warm brown skin, the way his eyes sparkled when he spoke, it was captivating. Ethan felt a strange flutter in his chest, something he hadn't felt before. He quickly looked away, focusing on the lake. Jordan caught the movement and smirked. "What's wrong? You're awfully quiet all of a sudden." Ethan shrugged, forcing a laugh. "Just thinking." "About what?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how to answer. "About how weird this is," he said finally. "I didn't think I'd actually enjoy talking to someone here." Jordan tilted his head, his grin softening into something more genuine. "Yeah, same. Guess we're both full of surprises." For a moment, they just stared at each other, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Ethan's heart pounded as he tried to make sense of the unfamiliar feelings swirling inside him. There was something magnetic about Jordan, something that made him feel both nervous and exhilarated. "You know," Jordan said, breaking the silence, "I've got a bet for you." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "A bet? What kind of bet?" Jordan leaned closer, his voice low and teasing. "I bet you're too scared to kiss me." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The playful smirk on Jordan's face was enough to make his head spin. He didn't know if it was the adrenaline of breaking the rules, the intoxicating energy of the night, or something deeper, but he found himself leaning in. "Oh, I'm not scared," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the wild thudding of his heart. Jordan's smirk widened as Ethan closed the distance between them. And then, under the cover of the night and the watchful gaze of the stars, their lips met in a kiss that was both soft and electrifying. Time seemed to freeze as they surrendered to the moment, a bold act of defiance against the rules that sought to contain them. When they finally pulled apart, Jordan's grin returned, but this time it was softer, more genuine. "Guess you proved me wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan couldn't help but smile back. "Told you I wasn't scared." For the first time since arriving at Camp Breakwater, the weight of their anger and frustration seemed to lift. Together, they had found something unexpected. Something that made the suffocating rules and rigid schedules of the camp seem insignificant. And as they sat by the lake, their connection growing stronger with every passing second. They both realized that this summer might not be such a punishment after all. The next morning, Ethan and Jordan moved through the camp like shadows, each carrying the weight of their shared secret. The kiss by the lake had changed something between them, though neither dared to speak of it as they went about their day. They kept their distance, avoiding the knowing glances that might give them away. Still, their eyes found each other across the camp, and in those fleeting moments, a silent understanding passed between them. Ethan spent the morning in group therapy, his mind far from the endless circle of forced confessions and hollow encouragement. His counselor's voice faded into the background as his thoughts drifted back to the lake. He could still feel the warmth of Jordan's lips, the rush of adrenaline that came with breaking every rule the camp held sacred. "Ethan," the counselor's sharp tone cut through his reverie. "Would you like to share what's on your mind?" He blinked, scrambling for an answer. No, he said bluntly, leaning back in his chair. The group stared at him, their judgmental eyes heavy, but Ethan didn't care. Let them think what they wanted. They wouldn't understand anyway. Meanwhile, Jordan was stuck in a trust-building exercise that felt more like a sick joke. He was supposed to let another camper guide him blindfolded through an obstacle course, but all he could think about was Ethan. The night before had been more than a moment of rebellion. It had been a connection, raw and unexpected, and it scared him just as much as it thrilled him. When the exercise finally ended, Jordan tore off the blindfold and stormed away, ignoring the counselor's protests. He needed space to think, to breathe. He wandered aimlessly until he found himself back at the lake. The memory of Ethan's smile, the way his blue eyes had sparkled in the moonlight, hit him like a wave. He sank to the ground, running a hand through his hair. What was he doing? This wasn't supposed to happen. By midday, the tension between them became unbearable. During lunch, they accidentally locked eyes across the mess hall. Ethan's lips twitched into a barely there smile, but Jordan quickly looked away. His chest tightened, a mix of frustration and longing swirling inside him. He hated how much he wanted to talk to Ethan, to feel that spark again. Later that afternoon, fate, or perhaps rebellion, brought them back together. During the mandatory fitness hour, the campers were divided into pairs for a trust-building run through the camp's trails. Ethan and Jordan ended up together, much to the dismay of the counselors, who had clearly hoped to keep the two troublemakers apart. "You good to keep up?" Jordan teased as they started down the dirt path, his tone light but his eyes serious. Ethan snorted. "Please, I'll leave you in the dust." The playful banter felt natural, a temporary relief from the storm of emotions they were both grappling with. As they ran deeper into the woods, away from the watchful eyes of the counselors, Ethan slowed down, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they were alone. "Last night," he said, his voice low. "Did that mean anything to you?" Jordan stopped abruptly, his breath coming in short gasps. He turned to Ethan, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and Ethan's stomach sank. But then Jordan took a step closer, his gaze softening. "Yeah," Jordan admitted quietly. "It did." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Me too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The tension between them crackled like electricity. The woods seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them standing there, caught in a moment that felt as fragile as it was powerful. Jordan reached out, his hand brushing against Ethan's. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. "We can't let anyone find out," Jordan said, his voice firm but tinged with fear. "If the counselors or the other campers figure this out?" "I know," Ethan interrupted. "We'll be careful." Jordan nodded, his jaw tightening. "We don't have much time left here, let's not waste it." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of hope and determination. "Agreed." As they continued their run, their footsteps falling into sync, an unspoken pact formed between them. This was their secret, their escape from the confines of Camp Breakwater. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: they were in this together. The days at Camp Breakwater passed with agonizing slowness, each one filled with rigid schedules and prying eyes. But for Ethan and Jordan, those hours between sunrise and sunset were merely obstacles to endure until the night. It was only then, under the cover of darkness, that they could shed the weight of the camp's oppressive rules and steal away to the lake. Their first few nights together were tentative, filled with whispered conversations and hesitant touches. They shared pieces of themselves they'd never shared with anyone else, stories of their childhoods, the pressures they faced at home, and the battles they fought to carve out their own identities. With each word, their connection deepened, and the lake became their sanctuary, a world far removed from the judgment and expectations of the camp. One night, as they sat side by side on the edge of the water, Ethan broke the silence. "I've never felt this way before," he admitted, his voice barely audible over the gentle lapping of the waves. "It's terrifying, but at the same time, it feels right." Jordan glanced at him, his dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Yeah," he said softly. "Me too." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the water. "But what happens when this is over? When we leave this place?" Ethan frowned, the thought of their impending separation like a cold weight in his chest. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I don't want to think about that yet. Not tonight." Jordan nodded, though the question lingered in the air between them. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Ethan's. It was a simple gesture, but it was enough to ground them both in the present moment. As the nights went on, their stolen moments grew bolder. They no longer hesitated to hold hands or lean into each other, finding comfort in the closeness that felt so forbidden within the camp's confines. The risk of being caught only added to the thrill, though it was a risk they knew they couldn't take lightly. During the day, they kept their distance, careful not to draw attention to themselves. But even then, their connection was undeniable. A quick glance during group therapy, a fleeting smile across the dining hall, the briefest touch as they passed each other on the trails, it was enough to sustain them until they could be alone again. One afternoon, during a group activity by the lake, a counselor named Mrs. Hartford seemed to take notice of their dynamic. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had a knack for picking up on things others overlooked. As the group dispersed for free time, she approached Jordan, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You and Ethan seem to get along well," she said casually, but there was an edge to her tone. Jordan shrugged, his expression carefully neutral. "We've talked a couple of times." "Why?" Mrs. Hartford studied him for a moment, her gaze uncomfortably piercing. "Just making an observation. Be careful not to get too distracted. Camp Breakwater is about self-improvement, not socializing." Jordan forced a smile. "Got it." As she walked away, his chest tightened. It was a warning, subtle but clear. He knew they'd have to be even more careful from now on. That night, when they met by the lake, Jordan told Ethan about the encounter. "I think she's suspicious," he said, his voice low. "We need to lay low for a while." Ethan frowned, his hand curling into a fist. "So what? We're not doing anything wrong." "You know that's not how they see it," Jordan said, his tone firm but gentle. "If they find out, they'll separate us. Maybe even kick us out." The thought of being sent home prematurely, of losing the one thing that made the camp bearable, sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, we'll be careful. But I'm not giving this up. Not for them." Jordan smiled faintly, a mix of relief and admiration in his expression. "Me neither." Their pact was unspoken but resolute. They would protect their connection, no matter the cost. And as they sat by the lake, the stars shimmering above them, they allowed themselves to believe, if only for a moment, that they could keep their secret safe. The following week at Camp Breakwater felt like walking a tightrope. Ethan and Jordan did their best to maintain their secret, but the tension of sneaking around began to take its toll. The camp's rigid structure left little room for mistakes, and the risk of being discovered was a constant weight on their shoulders. Ethan struggled to contain his frustration during group therapy. The counselors kept pushing him to open up, to acknowledge his anger issues, but all he could think about was how suffocating the camp's rules were. The only thing keeping him sane was the thought of seeing Jordan later. But even that wasn't enough to stop his temper from boiling over. One afternoon, during a mandatory team-building exercise, Ethan snapped. Another camper, a loudmouth named Brad, had been taunting him non-stop, poking fun at his reluctance to participate. When Brad made a snide comment about Ethan being a mama's boy, Ethan lunged at him without thinking. He shoved Brad hard, sending him sprawling into the dirt. "Ethan," one of the counselors barked, rushing over. "That's enough." Ethan's fists clenched, his chest heaving as he tried to rein in his anger. Brad scrambled to his feet, muttering curses under his breath, but the damage was done. Ethan was hauled off to the camp director's office, where he endured a long lecture about self-control and respect. That night, when Ethan met Jordan at the lake, his frustration was palpable. He paced along the shoreline, his hands running through his hair as he recounted the day's events. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice tight. "This place is driving me insane." Jordan watched him, his expression a mix of concern and understanding. "I get it," he said softly. "But you can't let them win. That's what they want. For us to break." Ethan stopped pacing and looked at him, his anger giving way to exhaustion. "I just don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Jordan stepped closer, his hand brushing against Ethan's. "You're not alone in this," he said. "We've got each other, remember? That's what matters." Ethan's gaze softened, and he nodded. "Yeah. You're right." Their moment of solace was interrupted by the distant sound of footsteps. Both of them froze, their hearts racing as they scanned the darkness. A flashlight beam cut through the trees, growing brighter as it approached. "Shit," Jordan hissed. "Someone's coming." They scrambled to hide, ducking behind a cluster of bushes near the lake. The flashlight's beam swept across the area, accompanied by the low murmur of a counselor's voice. "I know someone's out here," the voice called. "You're breaking curfew. Come out now, and this doesn't have to get worse." Ethan held his breath, his heart pounding in his ears. He could feel Jordan's shoulder pressed against his, the warmth of his presence somehow steadying him. The flashlight lingered near the bushes for what felt like an eternity before finally moving on. Once the counselor was out of earshot, Ethan and Jordan let out simultaneous sighs of relief. They emerged from their hiding spot, their breath still ragged from the adrenaline rush. "We can't keep doing this," Jordan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's too risky?" Ethan nodded reluctantly. "I know. But what choice do we have? This is the only time we can be ourselves." Jordan hesitated, then reached out to take Ethan's hand. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "We always do." The resolve in Jordan's words gave Ethan a glimmer of hope. Despite the challenges, despite the risk, they weren't ready to give up on each other. Not yet. As they walked back to their cabins under the cover of night, their fingers still intertwined, they silently vowed to hold on to their connection, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. The days at Camp Breakwater dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. Ethan and Jordan's secret moments at the lake became their only escape, but even those were fraught with anxiety. The counselors seemed to be watching more closely now, their suspicious gazes following the boys at every turn. Ethan felt the weight of it constantly. During lunch one day, he caught Mrs. Hartford's sharp eyes lingering on him again. She whispered something to another counselor, and he swore they both glanced in Jordan's direction. He tried to play it cool, shoving a forkful of bland camp spaghetti into his mouth, but his stomach churned. Jordan, sitting at another table, felt the pressure too. He kept his head down, laughing at some joke a cabin mate made, but his laugh didn't reach his eyes. He could feel Ethan's unease from across the room and knew it mirrored his own. Later that evening, during the mandatory group bonfire, the tension grew unbearable. As the campers roasted marshmallows and listened to one of the counselors drone on about accountability, Ethan and Jordan kept sneaking glances at each other. The firelight danced in Jordan's dark eyes, and Ethan felt his chest tighten. He wanted nothing more than to pull Jordan away, to find solace in their stolen sanctuary by the lake. Finally, when the camp was supposed to settle in for lights out, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He slipped out of his cabin as quietly as he could, the familiar thrill of rebellion mixed with a growing sense of dread. The gravel crunched softly beneath his sneakers as he made his way toward the lake. When he arrived, Jordan was already there, pacing near the water's edge. His face lit up when he saw Ethan, but the relief was short-lived. "They're watching us," Jordan said without preamble, his voice low but urgent. "I heard 2 counselors talking about how we've been sneaking out." Ethan swore under his breath. "What do we do? Stop meeting?" Jordan's jaw tightened, and he shook his head. "I can't. You're the only thing keeping me sane in this place." Ethan stepped closer, his hands brushing against Jordan's. "Then we'll figure it out. We'll be more careful. We'll meet less often if we have to, but I'm not letting them take this away from us." Jordan's expression softened, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. But their quiet resolve was shattered by the sudden sound of voices in the distance, counselors, and they were getting closer. "Shit," Ethan muttered, grabbing Jordan's hand. "Come on." They bolted into the woods, the underbrush scratching at their legs as they ran. The flashlight beams were too close for comfort, sweeping across the trees in frantic arcs. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, fear and adrenaline propelling him forward. When they finally stopped, panting and leaning against a massive oak tree, the voices had faded. The camp's main ground seemed far behind them now, the oppressive silence of the forest swallowing their breaths. Ethan turned to Jordan, his eyes wide with worry. "They're not going to stop until they catch us," Ethan said, his voice trembling with both fear and frustration. Jordan nodded, his expression grim. "We need a plan. Something to keep them off our backs." Ethan hesitated before a thought struck him. "What if we fake a fight? Make it look like we don't get along anymore. They'll stop watching us so closely." Jordan frowned. "You think that'll work?" "It's worth a shot," Ethan said, desperation edging his voice. "At least it'll buy us some time." Jordan considered this, then reluctantly nodded. "Okay. But let's make it convincing." The weight of their situation settled heavily between them. It wasn't fair, having to pretend, having to hide. But as they stood there in the moonlit forest, they both knew that their connection was worth fighting for, no matter what. The next day, Ethan and Jordan put their plan into motion. During breakfast, they staged their fight. "Why don't you just mind your own business for once?" Ethan snapped loudly, slamming his tray onto the table. Jordan glared back, his voice dripping with venom. "Maybe if you weren't so full of yourself, people would actually want to be around you." The cafeteria fell silent, all eyes on the two of them. The counselors exchanged knowing looks, their suspicion seemingly satisfied. Ethan stormed out, leaving Jordan behind, his fists clenched as if in anger. Later that night, they met by the lake, sharing a bittersweet laugh. "I think it worked," Jordan said, though his voice was tinged with sadness. Pretending to hate each other was harder than either had anticipated. Yeah, Ethan replied softly. But it doesn't mean we have to stop being real when we're here. With the end of camp approaching, Ethan and Jordan knew their time together was running out. On their final night, they met at the lake one last time, the weight of their imminent separation hanging heavy in the air. I wish this summer didn't have to end, Ethan said, his voice breaking. Jordan pulled him into a tight embrace, his heart aching. Me too. But this isn't the end for us. They sat by the water, their fingers intertwined, making promises they weren't sure they could keep. We'll find each other again, Jordan said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. I'll make sure of it. Under the stars, they shared a final kiss, their hearts full of both love and sorrow. The buses were lined up, ready to take the campers back to their lives. Ethan and Jordan exchanged a fleeting glance, their unspoken connection stronger than ever. As Ethan boarded his bus, he looked back one last time. Jordan stood by his own bus, watching him with a small, sad smile. Ethan raised a hand in a subtle wave, and Jordan nodded in return. In their hearts, they carried the promise they had made. This was not goodbye. One day, somehow, they would find their way back to each other. And when they did, the world would finally make sense again. What did you think of this story? Did the journey of Ethan and Jordan capture your heart? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a rating from 1 to 10 in the comments and share your feelings about their story. Did the characters and their connection resonate with you? Were you surprised by the twists and turns? And most importantly, would you like to see a continuation of their journey? Let us know if you'd like to dive deeper into their lives and see what happens after the summer ends. Your feedback is incredibly important, so don't hold back. Drop a comment below and tell us everything you think about this story.